I got a wicked cowboy hat that I bought in Lake Placid. It is legit.
You know how you know it's legit? Is if you paid like $500 for it. If you didn't pay $500 for it, which I know you didn't do because there's no way in hell you would pay $500 for a hat. It's just you're just a drugstore cowboy.
You are 100% correct. Yeah, no, I can't spend $500 on a cowboy hat. You crazy? I don't got fancy money here. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Rein It In, episode number 24, where we got 4 sticky notes to talk about. Number 1, we're going to talk about Canada's housing bubble, how prices could collapse another 40%, so they say. Number 2, we're going to talk about some macroeconomic trends. We're going to talk about population trends, and we're going to finish off with BC's naughty list. Not Santa's naughty list, but BC's naughty list. Get ready for it. It's going to be good.
Hey, folks. JG and I work hard to bring you great content. So just a real simple ask. Subscribe, comment, like, share. Let us know that we're doing a great job. And I promise you that we will continue to bring you great content. So hit the bell, hit the subscribe button, join us for some great content.
All right, Patrick, let's kick it off straight out of the gate. I know that we want to talk about, and we will talk about, some of the recent reports that have been issued about how Canada's housing bubble could collapse, housing prices another 40%. And we will definitely dig into that in just a minute. But I think we got to get sort of anchored with some of the macroeconomic updates that are happening right now. There has been some provincial real GDP growth forecasts recently issued by all the different provinces. And now we're starting to see provinces behave differently. And I think we got to remember, Patrick, for the last, 2-3 years, like throughout COVID, essentially all of the provinces and the entire market was all going in the same direction. It all went down for some time, and then it all went crazy up for some time. But now we're back to business as usual. We're back to seeing the different provinces doing different things, being impacted by different policies, as well as, and then we can go one layer deeper. We won't today, but we could go one layer deeper where we actually get into each region because they behave very differently. And we've been showing people that when they attend our DI Vault preview. DI stands for Deal Intelligence. If you go to di-vault.com, you can get registered for that event. We actually show people how it really differs even at the regional level. But for today's topic, let's talk about the different provinces and kind of get into this macroeconomic update.
Well, I want to go back and just kind of get people grounded in a few things. JG, I've been around long enough to have been through, I think, 5 different recessions. I've been through these cycles before, and I'm starting to see a repeat of some things. So we talk about macroeconomic, we look at the fundamentals, we talk about unemployment and GDP, and we really look at what drives real estate so that we have a view into the future, because as investors we get grounded in where's real estate going, not where it's been. The challenges we face in these economic times, especially with what's going on in a global macro picture, and there is a lot of, I'm going to call it rhetoric, I'm going to call it YouTube and Twitter experts, and the sky is falling, things are crashing, and everybody's focused on interest rates and immigration, and it's all really dark.
This causes it. This causes it. This causes it. Information overload.
Now, I'm not saying that there isn't some concerns, because there is. The thing as investors that we have to look at is say, in amongst all of this uncertainty and all of this confusion, where do the opportunities exist for us to put capital to work? Because when you look into the long term, real estate is still a great place to park your capital, to leverage your money. It is, right now we go through these times of, the bank is, having their stress test change. They actually don't want to fund investment. So it's harder, you're jumping through more hoops to get funding. All to say this, in all of that, there are some great opportunities. And so let's get grounded again in these economic fundamentals. It's why we do the research. It's why we keep bringing them forward, because it's the data, not the emotion, not the headlines, not the experts on Twitter going, there's a Canadian real estate bubble. I see that comment so often. It absolutely kind of drives me crazy, but people buy into it. And what we're here to say is don't buy into national averages, Canadian national bubbles. Like, we just got to get rid of the flutter, if you will, of dark and gloomy and all the rest of it. And I get All of it. It's all uncertain. It's all confusing. And that's what we're going to try and clear some of that clutter.
Two comments, Patrick. Number one, I think I'm going to call them Twexperts, which is Twitter experts. We're going to call them Twexperts. You know,
good one. But it's not Twitter anymore. They are, in fact, experts. So, anyways.
Twexperts. I think Twexperts kind of rolls off the tongue a little better, but I hear you.
What? My name's
Twexperts.
Learn it. Live it. Love it.
Funny enough, by the way, did you see a recent interview where Elon called X Twitter, and everybody laughed at him, right? Obviously, because even he's calling it Twitter, so that's kind of funny. But you talked about as we get into these macroeconomic updates, you talked about you having been through several recessions, in your 40 plus years of business. By the way, I notice every time I go through a recession, you seem to lose a little bit more hair. So I don't know how many recessions you got left in you, bro.
How many? I'm going to be shaving my head soon. There's no doubt.
So as we put up on the screen here, folks, you can see the GDP growth forecast for the provinces here, and it's kind of fascinating what's happening. And these are forecasts. These are by far as much wrong as they are right, Patrick, because rarely do these other experts, whether they're Twexperts or government experts, do they ever get it right? But this is what people are forecasting. You really see kind of a slowdown or kind of a stabilization across all of Canada. Alberta does better than most. Ontario at 1.1%, which is not much to write home about. BC's not much better at 1.2%. I'm kind of fascinated by Quebec under 1%. Not good for Quebec based on what they're looking at here.
Even the revised numbers, though, JG, have already gotten softer. So there's no doubt that we're kind of on this edge of really nothing happening, no real productivity. We'll talk a little bit about what's going on from an unemployment point of view. There's nothing exciting about this market. It is a little scary, but I always want to go back to something that we have to consider. When we look at a real estate market, we say, okay, well, GDP is softer, unemployment's starting to kind of start to tick up in some areas and in some sectors. So we want to pay attention to all of that. But there is a part of this market that we've never dealt with before, and that is the record immigration that we're going to be talking about. So when we look at that, is it going to last forever at 1 million people a year? I don't think so. I think at some point, the light bulb has got to go on for our government, and they got to pay attention to the fact that they're bringing all these individuals in. And, a lot of them, because of their employment qualifications, are looking for kind of menial jobs. And there's lineups at McDonald's to get a job, or Tim Hortons, or whatever retail outlet, big lineups. You see it a lot in Toronto and that area. But the point is that it is a factor that we have to consider into this when we look at housing. So will the 1 million people a year that they're trying to bring into this country, will it start to come down? I think so. But even if they cut it in half, even if they actually cut it by 70%, we're not keeping up with the demand of housing. And that's one thing that we got to kind of stay grounded in and really watch those numbers, because it is having a huge impact on what's going on right across the country, but then again, specifically to some provinces.
If people ask themselves, this is actually good, Patrick. I got a great chart on this. I should say you have a great chart on this because you found this chart. It's a good one that shows why we're bringing so many people into the country. And this one here showing population growth by natural increase, which is essentially births minus deaths. You really see this has come down significantly since the 1980s. Which is to be expected. And I think I don't see this going up much anyways. I'd be curious to see what those population experts or Twexperts, what they say, because the reason this was so huge in the 80s, by the way, is because from the 80s, that kind of 80 to 90 period, that's where the baby boomers were having all their babies, which is why it was so high. And it's been come down since because of that natural, the baby boomers getting older. Now the millennials have an interesting, because they're a pretty big cohort too, but you're just not seeing that pickup in terms of millennial babies.
Well, if you're on Twitter, they'll say because they're still living at home, they can't afford a home for their family, and there's probably some truth to that. When you look at the larger markets, which is Ontario based, and Vancouver a little bit. So when you look at the bigger populated, Ontario, Quebec are those big populations. So when you look at those numbers, yeah, they're probably going, no, I can't afford a house. I'm not going to have children. So we know that story is definitely happening. Again, when we look at this particular chart, natural births is really quite low. We need that immigration. And anybody who's got some common sense understands that immigration is, in fact, a very, very good thing. The challenge that we're facing is it seems to be almost ad hoc, throw a bunch of people into the mix and see what happens, as opposed to having any kind of control on it. So, the negative side of that is the downside that we're feeling is the effects on our infrastructure, our healthcare. And a lot of what's happening right now is, where are those people going to work? And, it's kind of a weird world in terms of that immigration, and how our federal government has opened up the gates with seemingly no controls over how that immigration is coming in, and even the filters of which they're coming in terms of their qualifications. What are their skill sets? It seems to be pretty random, and that's becoming problematic. And again, when we look at those numbers, there's something to pay attention to, is these are a lot of non-permanent residents and a lot of international students. And it's a mess in behind the scenes. Anybody who's paying attention is starting to see that kind of those headlines where international students, it's like 6 to a bump. It's crazy what's going on. That is more about the school system, the university college system, than it is about the government. These are all different conversations. From a real estate investment point of view, they're probably going to start to see a shift over the next couple of years of international students. And if you are kind of banking on that, if that's the cohort you're playing or the game you're playing, you need to be aware of that.
Yeah, it's definitely the student rental market is strong. There's no doubt about that. And curious to see where people are going to go, because you're seeing a lot of people that got out of the student rental market when COVID first hit, because that market was decimated when COVID first hit. In fact, when COVID hit, I remember you and I talking, and we did an event, and a lot of people with student rentals came to that event, and they said, what should we do? And I said, you should immediately convert your student rental to a long-term rentals until this passes. Those who did that, by the way, were very, very fortunate, because they rode the wave of higher rents. They rode the wave of tighter vacancies for the last 2-3 years. And now some of those people are going back into student rentals, or they're selling off those properties, or whatever the case may be. But that was a good move, and that's what a good real estate investor does, is you react to the market based on what's being presented to you.
Listen, the international student conversation is very politically charged. And so, there's no point in getting into it in that regard. We don't have control over it. Just know that these things are going to probably start to change. It's been a cash cow for a lot of universities, even to the degree that, when you lift the hood on it, they charge more for international students coming to their schools than they do from already placed Canadians going to the universities. They charge a different price. It's just this huge controversial issue. So I don't need to get into it. For investors who are playing that game, you may want to pay attention to it, and just know that I think this music's going to stop too.
Interesting. Patrick, I want to go back though. Listen, this is not on my sticky notes, but we got to bring it up, because you just talked about this narrative that people have about, I can't afford a home, and the millennials are still at home and they're in the basements and all this stuff. And I agree. Listen, I get that. I hear what people are saying, but I find it fascinating, and I just think it's an interesting. I know some people that still rent. They're into their late 30s. They're still renting. And I asked them why they're renting. And this is funny. And I say, now they can afford a home. I know their income. I know they can afford a home. They have the cash to be able to put a down payment. But here's the thing. They don't want the home they can afford. That's the truth of it. They don't want a starter home. They're not willing to buy something that requires a little upgrade, needs some work, doesn't have quartz countertops, doesn't have granite, doesn't have hardwood floors, doesn't have an ensuite bathroom, doesn't have a steam shower. I mean, I think, and I find this fascinating, because, Patrick, you don't have to go back very far. Look at your generation. You started out by buying a piece of crap home that you put a lot of sweat equity in to start and get your real estate journey started. So did I, right? And a lot of the younger people aren't willing to do that. If you rewind the tape even further back from your generation, I mean, I was talking to my dad about this. He was telling me about his dad, who literally stuffed newspapers to insulate the walls because they couldn't afford insulation, In fact, insulation wasn't invented back then, but that's for another story. The point is that people they did what they had to do. Today's generation is very different. I'm not knocking them for that, but I'm saying that's a huge part why people say they can't afford a home. I call bullshit on most of that, because if they really wanted a home, they can afford one. They just have to move to a center that's not Toronto or that's not Vancouver. They got to get out of town a little bit. They have to increase their commute. All of these things are possible. They choose not to.
Well, and I mean, certainly, I think that's part of it. I mean, there's also a mindset with a lot of particular cohort of generations where they don't want to own a home. I think it's a controversial issue. Nobody has the answers, and there isn't one thing.
That's okay. Those that don't want a home, I'm okay with that, Patrick. Yeah. But it's not those people that are sitting on Twitter, the Twexperts, that are bullshitting about the fact that they can't afford a home. If they don't want a home, fine. You don't need to have a home. It's not a necessary thing. But those that do want a home, they might want to adjust their expectation, and they can have a home.
Listen, there's so much out there. It's a controversial issue. So I hear what you're saying. And then along the lines, forget about affordability in terms of buying a home. There's affordability when it comes to the issue of being able to rent a home and being able to even find a home to live in. And a lot of this is based on what's happening with immigration, people coming into the country. And of course, they end up in Toronto, they end up in Ontario. And when they look at the availability of homes to live in, they're just not there. So Canada's inviting people to the country, come here, and then people are getting here, and number one, they can't find a place to live. Number two, they can't afford a place that they do find to live, and then they have to say, well, where do I go? And it's just right now, there's so much, and there's so many people coming into the country. This is all causing a lot of different problems. Again, it's politically charged. It isn't any one thing. Everybody wants to find it, this is the answer, that is the answer. There is no one answer. There's a lot of different, I guess we'll call them lanes, that people play in, and a lot of different problems that are being created by the degree of immigration and the housing shortage. So let's just give this one fundamental base underlying foundation, which is investors. When we invest in real estate, the fundamental, or often the fear that new investors particularly have, is, will I get my place rented out? Will I actually get the rent I need? Will there be a demand for my piece of real estate? And never before have we been able to say as positively, if you buy a good piece of real estate and you manage it well and you make sure you're buying it right and doing all the things you need to do, there's a lineup of people that want to rent your property. And it's softer at times in different regions? Yes. But I mean, your worst case scenario, I think anywhere in the country, is like a 3.5% vacancy rate, JG. That's as close to being empty as you can get. Like, that's as close to being, you can't get lower, because there's people always moving, right? So
it's a phenomenal bull market for rent. For those who own real estate, it's a great market to be renting real estate in. There's no doubt about that, for sure. But here's what's interesting about I'm going to show another slide here that talks about the construction investment, how it's gone down a lot. In fact, in the last couple of years. And Patrick, a little bit, I love showing, of course, graphs. I think they tell a great story. But I'll tell you, boots on the ground, and you saw my work boots a while ago, like you saw my muck boots. I mean, these are real work boots here, bro.
And you show that with me. They don't ever share that with me again. Really.
You saw they were dusty. Like
I
these
saw.
But here's a feet on the street analysis of this, and this is fascinating. August, in my view, has marked a real turning point for trades. Since COVID started, trades have went bananas, right? Everyone has been booked solid. Prices were going up. Nobody was negotiating anything. Timelines, you called a trade person and said, listen, here's my timeline. They would just laugh at you and say, I don't really care what your timeline is. Here's when I can get in there. And it's probably going to be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months until then, if not years. Okay. But August, things have shifted in August. I'm seeing it firsthand, where I'm getting phone calls from tradespeople saying,
hey, what do you got on the go, JG? What kind of renovation projects are you going?
And they're starting to warm up their database because they know the jobs are slowing down. So I'm starting to see that happen. And I started seeing that in early September. But my real test actually happened in the last 5 days, which is we have a big project going on in Oshawa right now. And a lot of my trades are in Peterborough, Lindsay, and in the markets that we do most of our business. So I said to my project manager, I want you to go out there and see if you can build some new trade relationships. And listen, in a hot market, trade relationships go one way. It sounds like this. Hey, do you want to come and give us a quote? Come to this project? No. Click. Like that's how it typically works. Let me tell you, he worked the phone for only a couple hours, and this was on Thursday of last week. And by Monday, so Thursday, there's only one work day, which is Thursday and Friday, and then, the weekend. And by Monday, he was booked solid with meetings, painters, drywallers, carpenters, electricians. Everybody was lining up to come and see our project. That's because they're getting hungry for work, Patrick. And that's showing in this chart. So feet on the street, this is in fact happening. How long is it going to last? I don't know, because there are some trades that are still quite booked up. HVAC is a good example. Drywallers, they're always impossible. But yeah, very interesting what's happening feet on the street right now.
I think you see the trades and say, well, where are their strengths in the trades? So you use drywallers as an example, or HVAC. I mean, how many people are even in that trade and what's the demand? So there's a lot of projects that are coming to fruition. The biggest thing in here is the investment. In this case, they're saying that the investment is starting to drop. And I think that's going to continue. I mean, builders have to look at ultimately at the costs of doing a project. And when you look at interest rates today, it's, quite frankly, do you want to pay that kind of rate in a project that's going to take some time to bring together? And I think that's the bigger issue. So there's a little bit of concern there, is that they're tapped the brake, and some have just outright said no more projects right now. We're seeing a lot of completions in the condo market, coming to fruition. So we're going to see what this market does, but it is interesting to know that at the end of the day, any kind of detached residence or home is not, there's not enough, full stop.
Yeah, that's interesting. Now this graph here you're seeing is actually a little bit of an extension of the last one. The last one was about, investment in the construction sector. This here, Patrick, is slowing labor demand in Canada. Altogether, you're seeing the unemployment rate starting to tick up. This is something you talked about a couple months ago, and it's coming to fruition. Another good call by you with good timing, might I add. So congrats.
Well, I think there's a few things that we have to pay attention to on the unemployment side of it. I think it is going to uptick. We need to pay attention to what it's going to be. It actually needs to, and I can't stress that enough, because when it comes to, Tiff Macklem, Bank of Canada, government, blah, 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 they're going to control inflation, all the rest of it. When we start to see unemployment tick up, when we start to see job vacancies go lower, we have to understand that I don't want to call it deflationary, but it takes the inflationary pressure off. And if we can keep labor costs under control, the demand for wage increases, to the degree that we can, given the cost of living, given inflation, that'll be helpful for us. And we want to pay attention to it. I still like to see it in that 6.5 range. I'm not worried about 7 economically. When you start to get over 7, you start to get a little bit nervous about what's going on. So we have to watch it really closely, because it is, in fact, a picture of what's happening on the productivity side of it. Now, we don't have the charts in here, so I'll just tell you right now that manufacturing in Canada continues to trend down. It's at flat at best. Our import exports have always been weak, continue to be weak. Our productivity in general, because we were so debt-driven, dependent on housing, that is kind of eating our lunch when we look at GDP. So there's nothing right now to pick up all of that slack on a national basis. We start to see provincially in Alberta and Saskatchewan, for example, we see a little bit more because of oil and gas, and because they're just really two strong provinces right now.
Very good. Patrick, I think that about covers update number 1 on the macro update. Boom. And that also, we talked about population in there. So we're going to do 2 sticky notes at once. Never been done before on this show.
Wow.
Sticky notes at one.
Okay.
Boom.
Did we talk about the Canadian involuntary labor? So in other words, part-time workers that are able to work full-time, this is a leading indicator. Part-time workers that want to work full-time but can't find full-time work. That's a bit of a flag. That is definitely in that orange flag territory and could get to red flag territory.
Well, it just means it's pointing exactly where we thought it was going, which is a little bit uptick in terms of unemployment is people that want to work, the work's not there. And that's because you're seeing that slowdown we've been talking about.
Yes.
All right, Patrick, next topic of conversation is BC's naughty list, not Santa's naughty list. That's a different thing. We'll talk about that closer to Christmas. But right now, we've introduced something called BC's naughty list. This is, I think, one of the first provinces, Patrick. By the way, this is going to happen across the country, I believe. I think, well, not that I believe. This is essentially the stated goal by the provincial governments, is they're coming out with naughty lists. And if those particular cities that are on the naughty list are not hitting their housing targets, they're going to be placed on this naughty list and their funding is going to get cut. That's essentially what this means, right, Patrick?
Well, it's not that their funding is going to get cut. It's actually that they're not going to get funded for infrastructure projects.
Here you go, one for you. And none for Gretchen Wieners. Bye.
Provincial government in this case says, okay.
You're a classic politician again. It's the same thing as the funding being cut. You just said the same thing, you just said it differently.
Well, what can I tell you? I'm just repeating what the politicians are sharing with us. This is a classic politics over policy kind of view. When you look at the chart, the provincial government says, okay, you need to hit these numbers. We need more housing. So municipalities, here's the numbers you got to hit. And if you don't hit those numbers, we're not going to fund some of your bigger projects. And all good, and it all looks very impressive. It all makes for good headlines. It makes like, look at us, we're working hard on that housing problem. And the reality of it is that they've set everybody up for failure. There isn't a hope in hell that they can hit any of these numbers, given interest rates, given builders, given labor. I mean, there's just not enough to go on to hit these numbers. So it's a classic case of the disconnect between what the ask is and what the reality is of being able to deliver on it. So like I say, good headlines, good politics. They're going to be able to blame the municipalities. We told you back in 2023, we need to hit these targets. You're not stepping up, blah, blah, blah. It's all a big story. They're not going to hit these numbers. There's not a hope in hell, but it makes for good headlines.
This is actually a really good point, Patrick. It's very rare that you make good points, but this is a good one.
The shade of it all.
Sorry. What I mean by that, I'm just kidding. But what I mean by that is this, I often talk about incentives. I think that for a system to work well, you have to have the right incentives. And this is a good example of, the province issues housing targets. But you just said, and it's very, very wise, is that the municipality is not in charge of those housing targets. It's people like us. It's real estate investors. It's developers that decide to do projects. Now, it is the city's job to push those projects through. That's where, by the way, they fail miserably, every friggin' one of them, just about. How can we measure that, Patrick? How can we measure the impact the city truly is having? Because if a municipality was to reduce the lag, reduce the timeline, increase the ability to get through zoning faster, issue building permits faster, if they did that, it would encourage us developers, me being one of them. That's, I agree, is only one small part, Patrick, because interest rates have to be right and so on and so forth. And financing has to be right and so on and so forth. But the one thing the municipality can control is that process. And my question is, how do you design a system to incentivize that which they can control? Because they can't control housing starts, but they can control the process of which they do control.
Well, the challenge we face, I know I'm happy to throw bureaucrats under the bus any given day because I'm just not a fan of bureaucracy and the problems that it causes. Bureaucracy, we know, is that at some point they have to justify their jobs. So they make things sticky, they make it more difficult, they get into their egos and they do the power trips and, they sit around and pontificate and have actually no connection to what the reality of somebody like you as a developer or developers in general are facing and the challenges. So they get this provincial command, if you will, and they say, okay, you got to do this or you're not going to get this. And nobody's really qualified within, I shouldn't say nobody. There are very few qualified within a municipality to actually take this project on and drive it through bureaucracy, get rid of it. You need a really strong mayor. You need somebody that has experience from even a business point of view. Most will go to we need more bureaucracy. We need more checks and balances. We need to control this more. And that's really what shuts things out. That's the first phase, is clean out bureaucracy and, streamline the and making sure that you're not compromising quality in some of the things that we need to do as builders, right? That's the first thing.
So I agree with you, but my question to you is, because you're very wise because of your years in business.
I know I'm an old guy.
Listen, how do you do that? What do we measure in order to, essentially the province is saying, listen, we are not going to fund some of your municipal projects if you don't hit these housing starts. I'm saying, okay, that's a stick, right? That's not a carrot. Actually, they have a stick and a carrot. We're presenting this wrong because the province also says, I know they do in Ontario, if you do hit the housing starts, we'll give you extra funding. So there's the carrot. And if you don't hit them, we'll remove funding. That's the stick. So they are using a stick and carrot approach. I just think they're measuring the wrong thing. My question to you is, what should they measure? Is it time in process? Is it what is it?
Well, I think there's a couple things that has to happen. When you look at a strong economic development kind of department, if you will, is you need to sit down with the developers. You actually need to sit down with them and have an open mind to what they need to get through the process. Mostly they don't even know what their sticky spots are. So it's like they work in a vacuum, and I'm not saying everybody's guilty of this. I realize I'm generalizing, but if you sat down with the builders, if you actually sat down with the guys that are, putting the boots to the ground, going for the financing, putting these projects in place, ask them what's in the way. That's the first thing that they need to do. If they sat down, let's face it, JG, you're a small developer. You make a difference in Peterborough. You do your thing. When was the last time economic development reached out to you, or you were able to reach out to economic development and say, hey, listen, if you want me to build stuff, I'm happy to do it. I can do a 6-plex. I can do an 8-plex. I can work on densification. Here's what I need in order to achieve that. Anybody ever done that with you?
Nope.
Okay, so that would be the first thing. The next thing is when you look at this, we dropped GST, 5%. It's really, when it nets out, it's going to be like guys who do math and who really look at these things say the net effect is like less than 1% or less than 2%. It's not that big of an initiative. Why isn't the government, who's acknowledged that there's a housing problem, why don't they look at these developers, work with the Bank of Canada, work with CMHC, and say, this is what we're going to do. We're going to provide builders low rent interest loans, and this is how they have to be to qualify for those loans, and we will lend the money at 3%, 4%, whatever the number is, not at 8% or 9% or 10%. Like, that's where the block is happening for builders, is that they have to get capital, and whether they do it privately, whether they do it through the bank, given what's going on, they are paying, really high rates, and then they can't pencil. The projects don't pencil. When they're done, what do they do with them, right?
That would for sure help, and that would be very helpful. And then I think on the city side, they really have to. Now, I got to say that the what the Ford government did with the 3 units instead of 3 units being by way of right, as they call it, now it's part of law. That's a huge help, especially to a guy like, for sure, that has saved some of my projects that I was holding off, saying I'm not going to do this because I know I'm going to be in zoning for 18 months, for 24 months. Now I'm putting those projects at the front of the pile, but now the financing's too expensive. But that's okay. The financing will come back because we can control that a lot more than we can control the zoning. But we need more of those kinds of laws to speed up that process, including the building permit process.
Okay, got it. So let's just think this through. You said it yourself. They've done that, and that's great. You celebrate that, and so great, awesome. A lot of builders probably will. But then you run into, well, okay, but interest rates are high, but that shall pass, okay? So right now, you may be touching the brake, and most builders are touching the brake because they're waiting for rates to come back down, saying they got to come back down at some point. But then a year passes, 18 months passes, 2 years pass, and what could they have done in that period of time? My point is this, is now government is not getting their taxes. They're not getting their transfer taxes. They're actually short selling themselves, if you will, or shorting themselves in terms of revenue that they can generate because we need housing, because they're not upping manufacturing. Let's face it, they're not upping manufacturing. They're not upping productivity. They're not doing a bunch of exports. So where's the revenue coming in? And now they're cutting off their nose in spite of their face. My point is, take that initiative that Doug Ford put in and Vancouver region put in and say, okay, we're going to streamline this to get units in, and we're going to do a short term. The Bank of Canada is going to cover it. The government's going to cover it, whether they do bonds or whatever they do, and they do a low rate for builders. Now, here's the key. They get builders building, and then ultimately, what does that do? It's reigniting the tax revenue that our government so desperately needs, and we rescue the part of the shorting housing, or the housing shortage, I should say, the shortage of housing, and get it in the queue now as opposed to in a year from now when rates might go down. So a long-winded way, but it's like there's just such a disconnect between all of it that you can't. The government that's creating the problem isn't going to fix the problem. That's ultimately the answer.
This is why I've said repeatedly, Patrick for Prime Minister. That's my slogan. Patrick for Prime Minister. That's my slogan. By the way, folks, if you're watching this and you agree, Patrick for Prime Minister, put it in the comments. Let's get a campaign going. I think we can convince Patrick to run for Prime Minister.
You would be thinking wrong. Anyways.
But now let's end on this chart, Patrick, which just puts graphically what we talked about a couple weeks ago on the last episode, some of the housing shortages, which they talked about across Canada. But here's a chart by province of where we're at. The blue boxes is what's projected to increase, right? By the way, that's just a projection. If you look at if you remember the original graph that we showed about construction investment, how it's essentially falling off a cliff. I'm actually scared we're not even going to hit the blue box, by the way, Patrick. I think that's a real reality. We may not hit the blue box. And then the kind of orange box, that's what we're missing to get to what they call affordability. I find that an interesting kind of play on how they're looking at this chart. But still, the point is, we're in a massive shortage. And you have been saying it for years, Patrick. This isn't going to change. This is not going to change.
Like you say, we go back to what I just said. The government that's causing the problem, and I think it's just government. As much as I'm not a fan of our current federal government, I don't care what government it is. As soon as you put government that's causing the problem and expect them to fix the problem, then you just know that it's going to stay status quo. So what does all this mean? For those of you who are still listening, as investors, look for those opportunities. Be the rental housing provider to fill the gap, the increasing gap of a lack of affordable and or even housing in general. That's why this is still a great strategy for that financial future. Invest in real estate. We need it, and there's a huge demand. You got clients lined up to get into good units.
Patrick for Prime Minister.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, last topic of conversation, Patrick, is to talk about, some of these reports, and we see them on the Twexperts all the time. Twitter experts, those are Twexperts, by the way, folks. If you've never heard of a Twexpert, you should go to x.com. You got a variety of Twexperts there. But the Twexperts, some people are calling for a 40% drop or more in the real estate bubble. There's reports coming out that Canada's in a housing bubble, which I find interesting. Patrick, what is your take on this? And then I will give you my take on this.
Well, I think we talk about housing bubble, and they've been talking about a housing bubble since forever. I mean, there's always a Canadian housing bubble, and I mean, when you look at the graphs and the things on paper, it's 8 times income and 10 times income, and interest rates are higher. It's got to deflate, but again, we look at what's happening just from a demand side versus a supply side. That keeps the bubble pretty inflated. I think that there are certainly some regions, some municipalities that are going to get hit. And but these blanket statements of Canada's going to get hammered and Canada's in 40%. And a lot of those predictions, by the way, are made by individuals who are observing Canada, who don't really understand what makes Canada tick, and they're from outside the country. That I see a lot of that as well, by the way. And so, will some regions get hit? Yeah, for sure. I don't know if it'll be 40%. Seems a little bit rich, but I'm not going to forecast any of it. I don't see it, but that's where I'm at.
I think what's interesting, Patrick, and we got this great chart. And by the way, in that particular Twexpert, and I have no idea who this person is, by the way, so I'm definitely unfairly characterizing this person. But in this case, the chart essentially, and this is a chart published by Toronto Star, by the way. Another expert for sure, another Twexpert, Toronto Star for sure. This is just pointing out essentially housing costs versus income. And again, Patrick, back to your point, it's comparing the US to Canada. And based on that chart, we're way too high, therefore it should come down. That's how they get to this 40% in terms of how they run their numbers. Now, what's interesting about this, Patrick, is we got some interesting data when it comes to essentially, like you said, what's happening in Canada with rents, right? You see rents constantly going up, still going up. And I think that a lot of for me anyways, I think the bottom, not the bottom, but you've already had for some markets, the market has come off quite a bit in terms of the highs from COVID. We've come down quite a bit in many markets. And I think there's definitely some price stability. Is it going to go down a little bit more? Yeah, it definitely could for sure. But I think that what's interesting is I think you're going to see a strong rebound once the interest rates. I know so many people that are just waiting in the wings for interest rates to stabilize and to stop going up. And they don't even have to go down very much, Patrick. They just have to stop going up. We only had our first rate pause in September, and I'm very curious to see what the government's going to do at the end of October, because I think if they pause again, I think that you're going to see some people coming back into the real estate market in a big, big way. And I certainly don't see a 40% drop. And that kind of statement in terms of again, we've always talked about it, making a Canadian statement on Canadian real estate prices, it just doesn't make any sense. It's like making a Canadian weather statement, like the weather in Canada is such and such. That doesn't make sense. Different weather patterns in different segments of the different regions. Same with real estate.
100%.
That's it. That's all you're going to say?
Well, no, I think you've covered it all. The only thing that I would add to this is that when we look at, rental, and you're saying rents are coming, down a little bit in some areas, for the investors, always consider the region, the town that you're investing in, the city you're investing in, and ask yourself, where are the jobs? Where are the jobs? Because, when you start to see unemployment start to come up, people will go to where the jobs are. So when you look at an economy, a municipality, a city, you go, what's driving that city? Like, if you look at Hamilton as an example, people are very bullish on Hamilton, and you look at the diversity of the economy, and so there's a reason to be. You look at the diversity and what they're doing in terms of their infrastructure growth, like their transit system. So you look at a city like Hamilton, and you can say, hey, this looks pretty good. And when you look at the downside, it's not as strong as some of the smaller cities or other cities, which are we call 1 or 2 horse towns, where if one of those industries gets hit by a recession and there is a downturn, then you start to see that unemployment and people are not working. That's problematic. So we pound this, JG. Look at the region, look at the city you're investing in. Are there jobs? Is there population growth? Is there a rising income? These are all things that we look at for the strength of any given region that we're in.
And if you want an incredibly fast way to do this, that's going to save you a ton of time and give you the information at your fingertips in real time on one screen from one source, go to di-vault.com and come and check out that platform. It is changing the way real estate investors are doing real estate because it makes it so much easier, so much faster, and makes you more efficient, more effective. And it's incredible. So check that out. And I want to leave everyone on one last chart, Patrick, because I think this is often the thing that nobody talks about, which is, there's so many points about debt levels, and there's so many points about house prices and so on and so forth. But the fact is this, and this is a great chart, is this is the dollars of assets for every dollar of debt. And you can see that this chart is constantly climbing, even with the pullback in prices in Canada. And you can see that on this chart too. Look at 2022, how it's come down from the tops there. The point still remains, Patrick. There's still a ton of wealth in the system, and that wealth will continue to work.
And it's interesting times, isn't it? Because we often look at the debt side, we don't look at the equity side of the equation. That's just the case. One thing we didn't talk about was there is an uptick in insolvencies in business. Now, I just happen to have friends over who've got some real big challenges with their business, but the business is mature, and they're sitting down with the bank, and the bank's looking at it going, you've got a ton of equity. So in spite of the fact that they are faced with some really big challenges business-wise for all sorts of reasons, the point of that is that what they have got is a lot of equity on the other side of the equation. So the bank is saying, your decision is really, do you want to keep eating away at this equity that you have, or what do you want to do? Like, these are the decisions that are being made. So in terms of a lot of the insolvencies that we're seeing in business, there is the other side of that equation, which is a lot of these business owners, especially those that have been around for a while, they've got a lot of equity. Now, in the just overall general population, this chart shines a big light on the net worth of people when you look at the equity side of the equation.
Yeah, 100%. It's interesting. It's all a balance. That's what it's all about. And fascinating to see where this is going to go. And the journey continues. Excited to see what October 2023 is going to bring.
Exciting times.
If you like what you learned here, go to the description below and subscribe for our free Insiders newsletter, where you can also stay up to date for our upcoming events and our courses.
If you want to see more stuff like this, click there.